What if the most powerful remedies for joint pain were never hidden in a laboratory, but were growing in plain sight for thousands of years? Today, millions rely on anti-inflammatory medications every single day. These drugs reduce pain, but often at a cost. Long-term use has been linked to stomach bleeding, cardiovascular risk, and other serious complications. Yet behind this modern system lies a lesser-known reality. Many of the compounds now being studied by leading research institutions didn't originate in pharmaceutical labs at all. They came from plants documented long before modern medicine existed. This is not speculation, this is molecular pharmacology. Researchers have identified specific compounds inside these plants that directly target the biological pathways responsible for inflammation. And that brings us to a critical concept, inflammaging. This term describes a chronic, low-grade inflammatory state that develops over time. It doesn't just affect joints. It silently drives conditions like arthritis, cardiovascular disease, and even cognitive decline. Because inflammation is not random, it follows specific biological pathways. These pathways control how inflammation starts. Modern drugs attempt to block parts of this system, but many plant compounds naturally interact with these same pathways. Not symbolically, not traditionally, but chemically, and that changes everything. Because instead of treating pain after it appears, you begin targeting the system that creates it. In this video, each of the 12 foods you'll see has been studied for its ability to influence these exact mechanisms. This is where ancient knowledge and modern science begin to overlap. Now here's where this changes. Before looking at the foods themselves, it's critical to understand the biology they are targeting. Because without that context, even the most powerful ingredients become just another list. The condition behind most joint pain today is known as inflammaging, a persistent, low-grade inflammatory state that develops gradually over time. It's not the kind of inflammation you feel when you get injured. It's quieter, more constant, and far more damaging in the long term. This type of inflammation is driven by several underlying factors: aging cells that no longer function properly, metabolic imbalance, changes in the gut microbiome, and continuous exposure to environmental stressors. But at its core, inflammaging is controlled by a small number of key biological pathways. And understanding these pathways is what separates guesswork from precision. The first is NF-κB. This is often described as the master switch of inflammation. When activated, it triggers the release of inflammatory signals, including cytokines like TNF-alpha, IL-1 beta, and IL-6. These signals directly contribute to joint tissue breakdown, stiffness, and chronic pain. The second pathway involves COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes. These enzymes convert fatty acids into prostaglandins, the molecules responsible for swelling, pain, and heat during inflammation. This is exactly where common drugs like ibuprofen and aspirin work. They block QX activity, which is why they reduce pain, but that's only part of the picture. There's a third pathway that often goes unaddressed, 5-LOX. This pathway produces leukotrienes, another class of inflammatory compounds that play a major role in chronic inflammatory conditions, especially in rheumatoid arthritis. Most standard anti-inflammatory drugs do not significantly affect this pathway, which means inflammation can continue, even when symptoms are partially suppressed. And this is where things become interesting, because certain plant compounds have been shown to interact with not just one, but multiple of these pathways. Some reduce NF-κB activation at the source. Others block COX enzymes directly, and a few target 5-LOX, the pathway that many pharmaceutical approaches leave open. This creates a different strategy. Instead of relying on a single point of intervention, these compounds work across the entire inflammatory network, not masking symptoms, but influencing the system that produces them. Each of the foods in this list has been studied for its ability to interact with one or more of these pathways through specific, identified compounds. This is not general nutrition advice, it is targeted biological interaction. And once you understand these mechanisms, the choices you make around food stop being random and start becoming strategic. Now let's move into the first group. The first entry begins with something most people already have in their kitchen: olive oil, but not just any olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil contains a compound that has drawn significant attention in the scientific community. That remarkable compound is oleocanthal. What makes oleocanthal remarkable is not just that it reduces inflammation, it's how it does it. Research has shown that oleocanthal inhibits COX-1 and COX-2 enzymes, the same enzymes targeted by common anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen. This is not a vague similarity, it's a shared mechanism. The same biological pathway, the same targets, the same outcome at the molecular level. This discovery was first identified through something unexpectedly simple. It was first discovered through a simple sensory reaction. High-quality olive oil produces a distinct stinging sensation at the back of the throat. That exact sensation is also produced by liquid ibuprofen. The reason is that both interact with the same receptors in the body. What began as an observation became a pharmacological investigation. And that investigation confirmed that oleocanthal works through the same COX inhibiting pathway. But there is an important distinction. The effect is not immediate or high dose like a pharmaceutical drug. It is gradual, cumulative. 2 tablespoons of high-quality extra virgin olive oil provide a measurable anti-inflammatory effect, roughly a fraction of a standard ibuprofen dose. Not a replacement in acute situations, but a consistent daily input that influences inflammation over time, and without the gastrointestinal risks associated with long-term NSAID use. However, there is a critical factor most people overlook: quality. Oleocanthal content varies dramatically depending on how the oil is produced and stored. Fresh, cold-pressed extra virgin olive oil contains meaningful levels. Refined or heavily processed oils contain little to none. Even storage matters. Exposure to light, heat, and time gradually reduces the active compounds. This means 2 bottles labeled olive oil can have completely different biological effects. One therapeutic, the other essentially inert. There is also a simple way to identify potency, that throat sting sensation. If it's absent, the oleocanthal content is likely too low to produce meaningful anti-inflammatory impact. This transforms olive oil from a basic ingredient into something more precise, a daily low-dose QX inhibitor, integrated directly into food. Not as a supplement, not as a treatment, but as part of a system. And when used consistently, it becomes one of the simplest ways to begin influencing inflammation at its source. But this is only one pathway, and what comes next expands that reach even further. The next food expands the strategy beyond a single pathway. Ginger, the next key regulator in our strategy. Unlike olive oil, which primarily targets COX enzymes, ginger operates across multiple inflammatory systems at once. Its key compounds, gingerols in fresh ginger and shogols in dried or heated ginger, have been studied for their ability to inhibit both COX and 5-LOX pathways simultaneously. This matters for the long-term management of inflammation, because most pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs focus only on QX inhibition. The 5-LOX pathway remains active, which means part of the inflammatory process continues, even when symptoms are reduced. Ginger addresses both of these critical pathways. It reduces prostaglandin production through COX inhibition, and at the same time limits leukotriene production through 5-LOX suppression. This creates broader coverage across the inflammatory network. This represents more than just partial control, but a more complete intervention. This dual action effect has not just been observed in laboratory settings. It has been tested in controlled human studies. In one clinical trial involving individuals with osteoarthritis, ginger extract significantly reduced knee pain and stiffness. The results were comparable to commonly used anti-inflammatory medications in that population. But again, the mechanism is different. It's not about high-dose, short-term suppression. It's about sustained modulation of inflammatory pathways through daily intake. There is also an important transformation that occurs depending on how ginger is used. Fresh ginger contains higher levels of gingerols. When ginger is dried or heated, these compounds convert into shogols, which have been shown in some studies to be even more potent in their anti-inflammatory activity. This means preparation method directly changes the biological profile. Fresh and dried ginger are not interchangeable, they are complementary. Using both provides a wider range of active compounds. And this makes ginger unusually versatile. It can be consumed as tea, in cooked meals, in powdered form. Integrated into daily food rather than isolated as a supplement, the daily dosage also matters for its effectiveness. Research typically uses the equivalent of 2 to 4 grams of ginger per day for measurable effects. This amount is achievable through normal dietary use. A teaspoon of ground ginger provides roughly half of that range, which means consistent use, not occasional intake, is what produces results. This positions ginger as something more than a spice. It becomes a daily regulator of inflammation across 2 major pathways. And when combined with compounds that target upstream signals like NF-κB, the system becomes even more effective. And this is where the next compound begins to operate. If ginger expands the range of inflammatory control, turmeric moves upstream, it targets the source. The primary active compound in turmeric is curcumin, and what makes curcumin significant is its ability to suppress NF-κB, the master switch that controls the entire inflammatory cascade. When NF-κB is activated, it triggers the release of multiple inflammatory signals, cytokines and enzymes, specific markers that drive the inflammatory response, chemical messengers that amplify and sustain inflammation throughout the body. Curcumin interrupts this process at the top. Instead of blocking individual outputs, it reduces the activation signal itself. This is why turmeric has been studied so extensively. There are thousands of peer-reviewed publications examining curcumin's effects across inflammatory conditions. The consistency of the findings is what stands out. Reduced cytokine production, lower expression of inflammatory enzymes, decreased oxidative stress, all connected to its influence on NF-κB. But there is a critical limitation that changes everything: absorption. Curcumin, in its natural form, has extremely low bioavailability. When consumed alone, only a very small fraction enters the bloodstream. Most of it is rapidly metabolized and eliminated, which means even regular intake may produce minimal measurable effect, unless absorption is addressed. This is where traditional preparation methods become highly relevant. There are 3 factors that significantly improve curcumin absorption. The first is black pepper. It contains piperine, a compound that slows the breakdown of curcumin in the liver. This can increase bioavailability dramatically. The second is fat. Curcumin is fat-soluble. Consuming it with oils or fats improves its ability to pass through the digestive system and enter circulation. The third is heat. Gently heating turmeric and fat enhances its solubility and makes it more accessible for absorption. When all three are combined, the difference is substantial. This transforms turmeric from a low-impact spice into a functional anti-inflammatory compound. Without these factors, most of its potential remains unused. With them, it becomes one of the most studied and biologically active plant compounds available. And this introduces an important pattern. It's not just about what you consume, it's how you prepare it. Because preparation determines whether the compound reaches the system it's meant to influence. And once that is optimized, the effect moves beyond isolated pathways into broader systemic control. But inflammation is not only driven by signaling pathways. In some cases, it's driven by something more physical, and that's where the next food operates. Not all inflammation is driven purely by chemical signaling. In many cases, it is sustained by the accumulation of damaged proteins and cellular debris within tissues. And this is where figs operate differently from everything discussed so far. Figs contain a proteolytic enzyme known as ficin. Proteolytic enzymes break down proteins. In the context of inflammation, this means they help dismantle the damaged or misfolded proteins that can accumulate in joints and surrounding tissues. These protein aggregates can contribute to stiffness, swelling, and reduced mobility. Ficin works by breaking these structures apart, supporting the body's ability to clear them, and importantly, this mechanism is truly distinct. It does not directly block inflammatory signals like QX or NF-κB. Instead, it addresses a physical component of inflammation that often goes unrecognized, and that makes it highly complementary to the compounds already covered. But figs do not stop there. They also contain quercetin, a flavonoid that has been studied for its ability to inhibit NF-κB activity. This means figs operate on two levels at once: enzymatic breakdown of inflammatory protein buildup and chemical suppression of inflammatory signaling. This dual role creates a bridge between structural and biochemical aspects of inflammation. There is also an important detail regarding how figs are consumed. Ficin is sensitive to heat. When figs are cooked, the enzyme becomes inactive, which means the enzymatic benefits are only present when figs are eaten fresh or dried without high heat processing. However, the polyphenols, including quercetin, remain active even after drying. So while cooking removes one benefit, but in doing so it preserves another. This creates two functional forms: fresh or dried figs for enzyme activity, and processed forms primarily for antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds. There is also a practical advantage. However, fresh figs are very seasonal, but dried figs are available year-round, and drying concentrates many of the beneficial compounds. A small daily amount can provide a consistent intake without relying on seasonal availability. This positions figs as something more than a fruit. They become part of a maintenance system, supporting both the breakdown of inflammatory material and the reduction of signaling that sustains it. But inflammation is not always driven internally. Sometimes external factors, including toxins, contribute to the load. And the next plant addresses that dimension directly. Inflammation is not always generated internally. In many cases, it is amplified by external factors that accumulate over time. One of those factors is toxic load. Heavy metals, environmental pollutants, and chemical residues can interfere with normal cellular function. They disrupt enzyme systems, increase oxidative stress, and contribute to chronic inflammation. This is where coriander and its fresh form, cilantro, enter the picture. These two forms come from the same plant, but they offer different biological effects. Cilantro, the fresh leaf, is rich in volatile compounds, particularly linalool. Linalool has been studied for its anti-inflammatory and pain-modulating properties. It interacts with inflammatory signaling pathways and may influence how pain is perceived at the neurological level. But cilantro's most distinctive role is something else. It has been shown to assist in the mobilization of heavy metals from body tissues. This process is often described as chelation support. Rather than directly neutralizing toxins, cilantro helps release them from storage sites so they can be processed and eliminated. This matters because stored toxins can act as continuous triggers for inflammation. Removing or reducing that burden can indirectly lower inflammatory activity. The seed form, coriander, contributes a different set of compounds. It contains phenolic acids and additional anti-inflammatory agents that have been studied for its ability to reduce inflammatory markers, such as TNF-alpha and IL-6. This means the same plant provides two complementary functions. The leaf supports detoxification and neurological modulation. The seed supports direct anti-inflammatory activity. Together, they form a broader strategy, not just suppressing inflammation, but reducing the underlying triggers that keep it active. There is also a practical advantage to using both forms. Cilantro can be added fresh to meals. Coriander seeds can be used in cooking, where heat helps release their active components. Using both regularly creates a layered effect, immediate pathway modulation, and longer-term reduction of inflammatory burden. This shifts the focus again from treating inflammation as a single problem to understanding it as a system influenced by multiple inputs. And once that perspective changes, the approach becomes more comprehensive. But inflammation is not only influenced by toxins or damaged proteins. In many cases, it is connected to the body's internal regulation systems. And that's where the next plant begins to operate. Some of the most effective anti-inflammatory compounds are not widely known. They are not commonly discussed, and they are rarely included in modern diets. Hyssop is one of those plants. It contains several bioactive compounds, but one in particular stands out, ursolic acid. This compound has been studied for its ability to influence multiple inflammatory pathways at once. It has shown activity in reducing NF-κB signaling, suppressing KOX2 expression, and limiting the production of inflammatory cytokines. This places it in a similar category to compounds already discussed, but with a broader range of influence. Hyssop also contains rosmarinic acid, another compound with well-documented anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. Rosmarinic acid has been shown to reduce oxidative stress and inhibit inflammatory enzymes. Together, these compounds create a layered effect. They do not just block one pathway, they interact across the system, and this makes hyssop particularly valuable in chronic conditions where inflammation is sustained over time. There is also a secondary dimension that is often overlooked: the connection between respiratory inflammation and joint inflammation. Both are driven by similar underlying mechanisms. When inflammatory pathways are active in one system, they are often active in another. Hyssop has traditionally been used to support respiratory health. Modern research supports this connection, showing that its compounds can reduce inflammation in respiratory tissues as well. This creates a crossover benefit, addressing inflammation in multiple systems simultaneously. Not as separate issues, but as different expressions of the same underlying process. The most common way to use hyssop is in tea form. This allows for efficient extraction of its active compounds, and because these compounds are water-soluble, they are absorbed relatively easily. Daily use builds a consistent presence of these anti-inflammatory agents in the body, not in high doses, but in steady cumulative amounts. This pattern continues to repeat, small, consistent inputs, acting across multiple pathways, gradually shifting the inflammatory baseline, and once that baseline begins to change, the effects extend beyond individual symptoms. But inflammation is not only controlled by what enters the body, it is also influenced by how the body processes and eliminates internal compounds. And that brings us to the next mechanism. Inflammation is not only created by what enters the body, it is also influenced by what the body fails to eliminate efficiently. And this brings attention to a system that is often overlooked in discussions of joint health. This brings us to the liver. The liver is responsible for processing and removing a wide range of compounds, including metabolic waste, environmental toxins, and inflammatory byproducts. When this system becomes less efficient, these compounds can accumulate, and when they accumulate, they contribute to systemic inflammation. This includes inflammation in joints. Dandelion operates directly within this system. It contains compounds such as taraxacin and luteolin, both of which have been studied for their role in supporting liver function and reducing inflammation. One of its primary effects is the stimulation of bile production. Bile is essential for the elimination of waste products processed by the liver. When bile flow is reduced, these compounds can be reabsorbed into circulation. This creates a continuous cycle. The body attempts to eliminate inflammatory substances, but instead, they continue to circulate. Dandelion helps interrupt that cycle. By increasing bile flow, it supports the removal of these compounds before they can contribute further to inflammation. At the same time, luteolin provides a direct anti-inflammatory effect. It has been shown to inhibit NF-κB activity and reduce the expression of inflammatory enzymes. This creates a dual mechanism: improved elimination of inflammatory compounds and reduced production of new ones. There is also an important characteristic that defines dandelion. That essential functional property is bitterness. Bitter compounds trigger specific digestive responses. They activate receptors that signal the liver and digestive system to increase activity. This is not incidental. It is a functional property. The bitterness itself is part of the mechanism. This is why many traditional systems emphasized bitter herbs as part of regular diets. Not for taste, but for their effect on internal processing systems. Dandelion can be consumed in multiple forms: fresh leaves, teas, or as part of mixed greens. Each form provides access to its active compounds, and consistent intake supports a gradual shift in how the body processes inflammatory load. This expands the model once again. Inflammation is not just about blocking signals. It is also about improving the systems that clear them. And when both are addressed together, the overall burden begins to decrease. But there is another factor that plays a critical role in joint health, and that's where the next food becomes significant. Up to this point, the focus has been on reducing inflammation, but joint health involves another critical factor. It is about protecting the joint structure itself, because inflammation does not just cause pain. Over time, it contributes to the breakdown of cartilage, the tissue that allows joints to move smoothly. And once cartilage is damaged, recovery becomes significantly more difficult. This is where pomegranate operates differently. It does not just reduce inflammation, It helps protect the joint from structural degradation. Pomegranate contains a class of compounds known as ellagitannins. When consumed, these compounds are converted by specific gut bacteria into a metabolite called urolithin A. This biological transformation is critically important because urolithin A has been studied for its ability to support cellular repair processes and reduce inflammation at the mitochondrial level. But beyond that, pomegranate has a more direct effect on joint tissue. It has been shown to inhibit matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs. These are enzymes responsible for breaking down collagen in cartilage. When MMP activity increases, cartilage degradation accelerates. This is a central feature of osteoarthritis. By reducing MMP activity, pomegranate helps slow this process. It is about more than just easing the symptoms, but preserving the structure that prevents those symptoms from worsening. There is also a dependency that affects how effective this process is. The conversion of ellagitannins into urolithin A depends on the composition of the gut microbiome. Not everyone produces this compound efficiently, which means the same food can have different levels of impact depending on internal conditions. However, even without this conversion, pomegranate still provides anti-inflammatory benefits through its polyphenols and antioxidants. This creates multiple layers of activity: direct inhibition of cartilage-degrading enzymes, support for cellular repair, and general reduction of oxidative stress. How it is consumed also matters. Whole pomegranate seeds provide fiber, which supports the gut microbiome involved in conversion. Juice provides a higher concentration of ellagitannins. Each form contributes differently. Together, they create a more complete effect. So far, the pathways addressed include NF-κB and KOX, but there is still one major inflammatory route that often remains active: 5-LOX. This pathway produces leukotrienes, compounds that contribute to persistent inflammation, particularly in chronic joint conditions. Most common anti-inflammatory drugs do not significantly affect this pathway, which means even when pain is reduced, inflammation may still continue beneath the surface. Frankincense changes that. It contains a group of compounds known as boswellic acids. Among them, one stands out: AKBA, acetyl-11-keto-beta-boswellic acid. This compound has been studied for its ability to specifically inhibit the 5-LOX enzyme. This is not a general anti-inflammatory effect. It is targeted, directly closing a pathway that is often left open. This creates a critical shift. Instead of partial suppression of inflammation, the system becomes more fully addressed. COX pathways reduced, NF-κB signaling suppressed, and now 5-LOX activity limited as well. This multi-pathway coverage is what changes the overall outcome. Frankincense has also been evaluated in controlled clinical settings. In studies involving individuals with joint conditions, standardized extracts have shown measurable reductions in pain, swelling, and mobility limitations. These results were not theoretical. They were observed in real-world conditions. But there is another factor that makes this compound particularly important: tolerability. Many pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs interfere with KOX1, an enzyme that protects the stomach lining. This is one reason long-term use can lead to gastrointestinal complications. Boswellic acids do not significantly inhibit KOX1, which means they avoid this specific risk. This makes them suitable for sustained use in situations where long-term inflammation control is needed. However, consistency and quality are essential. The concentration of active compounds can vary widely depending on how the extract is prepared. Standardized forms ensure a reliable level of AKBA. Without that standardization, the effect may be minimal. This introduces a key idea. Not all forms of a compound produce the same result. Precision matters, because when targeting specific biological pathways, the presence of the active molecule is what determines the outcome. Frankincense represents a missing piece, a pathway that is often ignored, now directly addressed. But inflammation is not only about biochemical pathways. Pain itself is a separate experience. And the next compound works at that level. Up to this point, the focus has been on reducing inflammation and protecting joint structure. But pain itself operates through a different system. It is not only the result of inflammation, it is also a signal processed by the nervous system, and this is where myrrh becomes relevant. Myrrh contains a compound known as furanudesma 1,3-DNA. This compound has been studied for its interaction with opioid receptors. These are the same receptors targeted by many pharmaceutical pain medications. When activated, they reduce the perception of pain. What makes this significant is not just the effect, but the mechanism. Instead of only reducing inflammation to indirectly lower pain, myrrh interacts with the signaling system that transmits pain itself. This creates a second layer of support. Inflammation is addressed through multiple pathways, and at the same time, the experience of pain is modulated directly. There is also an additional effect. Myrrh contains terpenoid compounds that have been shown to influence NF-κB activity. This means it contributes to inflammation reduction as well, so its function is dual: direct pain modulation and indirect anti-inflammatory support. This combination makes it complementary to the other compounds discussed, each one targeting a different aspect of the overall system. There is also historical context that aligns with this mechanism. Myrrh has been used for centuries in preparations intended to reduce discomfort. Modern research now provides an explanation for why those applications were effective. The interaction with opioid receptors offers a clear biological basis. However, the role of myrrh is not to replace stronger interventions when needed. It is part of a layered system, one that reduces reliance on a single approach by addressing multiple dimensions simultaneously. Pain is not just a symptom, it is part of a feedback loop. When pain is reduced, movement improves. When movement improves, circulation increases. And when circulation improves, inflammation can decrease further. This creates a reinforcing cycle, and compounds that influence both inflammation and pain contribute to that shift. But there is still one major factor that has not been addressed directly, a driver that operates silently in the background, influencing inflammation across the entire body, and that is stress. Not all inflammation begins in the body, some of it begins in the mind. Stress is one of the most overlooked drivers of chronic inflammation, but its effects are not psychological alone, they are biochemical. When the body experiences ongoing stress, it activates the HPA axis, the system that controls the release of cortisol. Cortisol is essential in short bursts. It helps the body respond to immediate challenges. But when cortisol remains elevated over long periods, it begins to disrupt normal regulation. It increases inflammatory signaling, it weakens the body's ability to control immune responses, and it accelerates tissue breakdown, including in the joints. This creates a direct link between stress and inflammation, not as separate conditions, but as parts of the same system. Holy basil, also known as tulsi, operates within this connection. It is classified as an adaptogen. Adaptogens help regulate the body's response to stress, not by blocking it, but by stabilizing it. Compounds in holy basil, including eugenol and ursolic acid, have been studied for their ability to influence both stress response and inflammation. Eugenol contributes to COX-2 inhibition, directly reducing inflammatory activity. Ursolic acid influences NF-κB signaling, helping suppress the production of inflammatory cytokines. But the defining feature is its effect on cortisol. In controlled studies, consistent intake of holy basil has been associated with reduced cortisol levels. This shifts the internal environment, lower stress signaling, reduced inflammatory activation, and improved overall regulation. This is important because inflammation is not only triggered by physical factors, it is also amplified by internal states. Addressing those states changes the baseline, not temporarily, but continuously. There is also a practical advantage. Holy basil can be consumed as a tea. This makes daily intake simple and consistent. And consistency is what allows adaptogenic effects to build over time. This introduces another layer to the system. Inflammation is influenced by pathways, compounds, toxins, and structure, but also by regulation. And when regulation improves, the entire system becomes more stable, which leads to the final step. Not a single food, but a complete framework. A combination that brings all of these mechanisms together into one unified approach. And this is where everything connects. Up to this point, each food has been presented individually, each one targeting a specific mechanism, a specific pathway, a specific part of the inflammatory system. But the real impact appears when they are combined, because inflammation is not driven by a single cause, it is a network. And addressing a network requires a system. This is where the concept of synergy becomes essential. When multiple compounds act across different pathways at the same time, their combined effect is greater than any one of them alone. One reduces NF-κB activation, another blocks QX enzymes, another closes the 5-LOX pathway. Others support detoxification, protect joint structure, or regulate stress. Individually, each creates a shift. Together, they reshape the entire inflammatory environment. This is not about replacing one intervention with another, it is about building layers. Layered inputs, acting continuously across multiple biological systems. There is also a pattern that emerges. Many of these foods provide more than one function. They do not operate in isolation, they overlap, reinforcing each other's effects, creating redundancy within the system. If one pathway remains active, another compound addresses it. This reduces dependence on any single mechanism and increases overall stability. There is also a time component. Pharmaceutical approaches often focus on immediate results, rapid symptom reduction. But these compounds work differently. They are gradual, cumulative. Their effect builds over time through consistent exposure. This changes the expectation from instant relief to sustained regulation. And with that shift comes a different outcome, not just reduced symptoms, but a lower baseline level of inflammation. This is where daily habits become the deciding factor. Small inputs, repeated consistently, begin to influence long-term biology. Food stops being passive, it becomes active, functional, directed. And when this system is applied consistently, the body begins to operate under a different set of conditions. Lower inflammatory signaling, improved cellular function, better structural support, and more stable regulation. This is not a single solution. It is a framework, a way of approaching inflammation from multiple angles at once. But a framework only works if it is applied. And that brings us to the final step, how this system translates into daily practice.